Okay. All right. 1 minute has passed. Okie dokie. Can everybody see my screen? Cool. Awesome. Wonderful. Excellent. Okie dokie. So here we go. Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to my first ever panel. I am totally not nervous at all. Please feel free to ask questions at any time. I'll be pausing after every slide to check for questions. Speaking of questions, please remember to keep questions, comments, etc. in the channel Panel Discussion 5. There is a script available for those who want or need it. I'll be posting the link to that in the chat now, if I can get the link. Okay, posted in the chat. Be aware that there may be times that I accidentally go off script or read things a little differently, but for the most part, other than answering questions, the whole panel is there. On the script, each slide has its own page or pages to help keep things organized and make it a little easier to read. If you need to skip to the if you need to skip to the script for a certain slide, you should be able to click on the heading in the outline and it will take you directly to that slide's page. I can also provide a link to the presentation itself by request after the presentation is over. The presentation is pretty boring and lackluster, though I'm really not the best at making PowerPoints. Anywho, without further ado, first, a little bit more about who I am. You can call me either Jay or Victor. I go by both interchangeably. I'm 25 years old, and I use he/they pronouns. I've been in and out of Therian/Otherkin spaces since 2015, more solidly since last year, but I've always identified as non-human. I'm a con-Therian, which means that I have experienced my non-human identity all day, every day, for my entire life, without change. I was considering doing another panel about this, but I'm not sure I'd be able to get the script for that without turning it into an entire essay, and my keyboard isn't really working at the moment, so not sure if I'll have the capacity to write that script. But more specifically, I'm an Anymic Therian, which probably explains why I wanted to do this panel. I'm assuming that there are no questions or comments yet, but I am checking the chat regardless. Cool, good, excellent. Next slide. So how was the term coined? It all started with a thread called Coining Unique Kin in an Alterhuman Discord server by a user called the Flying Potato. I was curious and decided to check it out, and read the initial description to discover that the OP was describing my exact experience, having an identity that is almost completely or entirely known to the being who holds it, but one that doesn't fit any known species and wasn't created by that being. But I didn't necessarily, sorry, skip to that too early. But I didn't necessarily like the term unique kin. It felt too ununique personally. And yet I hadn't really thought until that moment about coining a term that could be used to describe this experience. I ended up throwing myself headfirst into research and thinking about a term that could both succinctly describe the experience and also flow better when spoken. After a few hours, I finally came up with the term anymic. But thankfully the name stuck, and the original creator of the thread and the others who had joined in liked it, and it became the official term. Together, we all created a definition that felt like it really encompassed what we wanted it to encompass. On January 2nd of 2024, we came to a decision on the definition, and the term was officially coined. That said, I will note that there's some variation between our definitions. So for me personally, I find the lack of a proper name to be the most important aspect of why I need to use this term to describe my identity. That means for me, I put that part of the definition first. The uniqueness of my identity, the fact that it may be the only one of its kind, or at the very least would be very rare, is somewhat less important to me, so I put that last. For others who are involved in the process, they use the same definition but in reverse. The uniqueness is more important to them, so they put that first and add the lack of a name last. The definition is the same, it's just that some of us put more emphasis on different parts. Any questions, comments, etc.? Cool. Just going to check for questions real quick. Okay, seeing none for now. If I see any later, I'll get to those. Okay, next. Why the term was coined. So before we get into the full definition and etymology, I think it's important that I talk about why the term was coined in the first place. While it may seem paradoxical, it helps to give a name to something that otherwise has no name. A name might not be important to everyone, but there are some times where it really helps, such as when you're asked what your non-human identity is, coming into non-human spaces and being asked, so what is your therio slash kin slash where slash alter type, can be one of the most frustrating things when you have an anemic identity. While most folks can just say, I'm a cat or I'm a dragon, those of us with anemic identities haven't really had that luxury. And it's not like we can just say, um, it's not like we can just say unknown or questioning because we do know and we're not questioning. We just don't have a succinct word to explain that to you. Saying it's complicated is also not quite accurate because it isn't complicated, or at least it wouldn't be if we just had names for these identities. And also saying I know, but I don't know the name of it, so here's a 3-page paper to tell you all about it, is also not the most ideal thing. Not that I'd know what that's like, of course. But of course, most importantly, it's a term that helps to describe an experience that, to my knowledge at least, has not been given a title before this. Anemic identities have always been out there, but it really isn't until now that we have an actual term to call them by, or that they've been acknowledged on a broader scale. Okay, questions, comments, etc. Cat and a dragon. Hell yeah. Wouldn't being an animal that only exists in your mind be an endemic? Potentially. We'll get more into some examples later, but potentially. Okay, gonna go to the next slide, and then again I can check on questions later. All right, so we finally come to the etymology and definition. The etymology of anemic is incredibly straightforward. It's the Greek prefix a, meaning without, the Latin suffix ic, meaning a state of being, the Greek root word nim, meaning name, and so together we get being without a name. Originally, I was going to be using anomic, which is the exact same thing except the Latin root word for name, but anomic is actually a medical condition in which an individual has significant difficulty remembering names, so that was a definite no, and the Greek version would just have to do. As for the definition, my definition is a known identity without a formal name, which may be the only one of its kind or one of very few. Sorry. Again, I personally place more emphasis on the lack of a name, but this definition is interchangeable with the definition others might use, which is an identity that is or likely is the only one of its kind slash type and does not possess a formal name. But now that we know how and why it all came to be and all of the definition and etymology stuff is out of the way, we can get into some more of the specifics. Before I do that, I will check for questions. Yay, Latin. Yay, Latin. Okay, so how to use this term. Primarily, this term is meant to be used as a sort of sub-identifier, a micro-label, if you will. What I mean by that is it's a label that you add on top of another much broader label. Here are some mostly hypothetical answers, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. An anemic Therian would just be someone with a non-human animal-like identity that is entirely anemic. This would be a species that has, so far as the identifier is aware, no known examples in either fact or fiction. Or An anymic fox or vulpine therian, on the other hand, knows that they are some kind of fox species, but the exact traits and experiences that they have don't fit any known fox species in fact or fiction. Similar to the anymic fox/vulpine therian example, an anymic dragon would be a type or species of dragon that has no equal in any myth or fiction that can be found by the identifier. The being knows that whatever they are is draconic, but the exact species or type is unnamed. In most cases, someone like this might just choose to identify as simply draconic, but I could totally see someone deciding that it's important to them to specify that their draconic identity is anymic. Another possibility is that someone could even be an anymic cladotherian, identifying as an entire unnamed clade of species. And of course, many, many more. It could also be used as a label on its own, though. You could just say, I'm anymic, whatever that means to you. It may have been intended to be a microlabel, but if you feel like there's nothing to add to it and that your identity is simply, wholly, entirely anymic, that's totally valid too. Questions, comments, etc. I'm so glad that there's other people that wanted a term like this. Yay! It's not just me being totally selfish. No, I know that there's other people too. I've met quite a few. Um, oh yeah, totally. I've been worried about that too in terms of hearing it as anemic. I I thought about that a lot when we were coming up with the term itself. Um, but we just couldn't really think of anything else that was like that really just felt right, I guess. Um, and so we decided to just kind of go with it regardless. So I'm sorry that it sounds a lot like anemic, but this is kind of what we got right now. Anyways, moving on a little bit. What are some examples of what an anemic identity could look like? Well, first of all, it could be anything. That includes identities that aren't non-human. While this term was created specifically with non-human identities in mind, I could totally see this being used to describe a gender or sexuality or any other kind of identity. But um, since this is a Therian-centric con, let's focus on those non-human identities. One potential example is what is known scientifically as an undescribed taxon. This is a species that is known to exist either by physical observation or fossil evidence, but has not yet been given a taxonomic name. It's entirely possible for someone to see an image of or hear the description of an undescribed taxon and say, that's me, but that identity would have no name, which, in my opinion, could make it an anemic identity. It's also entirely possible that someone could identify as a species that does in fact currently exist, but is not known to exist by scientists or even by humanity as a whole. New species are being identified all the time, and there will likely be some species that are simply never found. This could be due to just being extremely secretive/secluded. It could be due to being extremely well camouflaged to the point where it's nearly impossible to spot them. It could be that there are so few of them that seeing one is extremely unlikely. Or it could be a mix of all three. Similarly, someone could be a species that is extinct and unknown by scientists/humanity. The chances that fossil evidence will be found for every species that has ever existed are slim to none. There will always be species that we will never know about. There will be some that we can guess existed based on speculation, and there may be some that are far beyond what we could ever conceive. A good example of a species that we know has to exist but has no fossil evidence is a transitional bat species. They have to be out there, but we just haven't found them yet. If someone finds they have experiences that are both bat-like and also similar to much earlier bat ancestors, they might realize that they identify as one of those transitional species. But since none of those fossils have been found, they might consider their identity to be anemic. Or they might be fine with just saying, I'm some sort of proto-bat. Either one totally works. Another possibility is a futuristic identity, a species that will someday exist but currently does not and has not been speculated by humans. An Anymic identity could also be a fantastical or cryptid species that is not found in any sort of historical accounts or media. Humans see a lot of things and tell a lot of stories, but not all of those stories are passed down in ways that are easily accessible. One example of a creature that exists in a story passed down in one single family is a winged cat creature called a Cyrax, which, so far as I can tell, has only been mentioned in the Messy Beast article about fantasy stories of winged cats and wasn't even given a full description. If it weren't for the author knowing a person that this story had been passed down to, we'd never know that there's a winged cat creature in folklore called a Cyrax. So someone could identify as one, but never come across that name, and therefore have an anonymic identity. Or breaking away from species that, for some reason or another, are unknown or unnamed. I think it would be reasonable to say that someone could claim an anonymic identity if their species identity correlates to a known species that just isn't commonly known, and thus they haven't come across it in their research yet. An example of this would be someone who has tried out various similar species identities, but none of them seem to stick. Like someone who experiences traits similar to both a cheetah and a puma, and maybe a few others that don't seem to quite fit either. Unless they specifically know to research Pleistocene age species, they might never discover that the American cheetah, Myricinus inexpectatus or trumani, fits their experiences perfectly. If that being never comes across it, and no one ever suggests it to them, they might take on the title of anonymic identity. Hopefully that makes some semblance of sense. Questions, comments? Yes, Cyrax is Syrax. So if it's okay, so if someone could is yeah, so someone could be anemic, but then the animal is discovered and named, and they are no longer anemic. I would say yes, just by the nature of the term. Um, I think that if the person is like, yeah, that's totally the one, and like the name is like that fits them, then yeah, they can just take that name, and are no longer anemic. But again, I try not to be super gatekeepy. Um, but yeah. Um, anyways, next one. Speaking of me not trying to be super gatekeepy, we do understand what the basics of what an anemic identity is, but it's also crucial that we understand what it is not. This is mostly to help folks understand how this term differs from the other already existing identifying terms. So, an anemic identity is not a questioning identity. An anemic identity is an identity that is known, that is mostly or fully known by the one who is experiencing it, but doesn't fit any known category or term. Now, here I'm not here to gatekeep anyone's experiences, like I said, and say who can or can't use the term anemic to describe their identity. And also, I still think it's important to maintain this as a last resort kind of term. This is the kind of term that I can see most commonly being used by beings who have been researching, who have been trying to dig for and research something that fits the way they feel for years and still come up with nothing. That's not to say that those who are more freshly awakened can't use the term. Last resort will look different for everyone. And for some, they may struggle with research and end up taking on the term anemic until someone else can help them find out what fits. It's also not an OC identity. An anemic identity is not an identity that is created by the being that holds it. It's something that's intrinsic in some way. It's something they know. It's something they know is who they are, even if it doesn't seem to match anything else in the world. Now, I think it's perfectly reasonable to have an OC that is an anemic species, and then maybe that being can idea is that OC, but here's where it gets a little hard for me to explain. It really comes down to the fact that even if the OC being, yeah, even if the OC being identifies as is an anemic species, they still have the ability to say that they are OC-kin. Maybe they are an anemic OC-kin, but the point is, the term for identifying as an OC, whether it's anemic or not, already exists and is commonly used as an identifier when asked what a being's type is. Anyways, all of that said, it's also totally valid for someone with an anemic identity to create an OC based on their identity. So anemic does not equal OC-kin, but could turn into OC-kin. or could potentially be a subcategory of OC-kin. And finally, it's not an identity that's set in stone. As a last resort term, most folks with anymic identities still try in some capacity to figure out if their identity might exist with another name out there somewhere, even after deciding to take on the term. It's possible that someday, maybe mere moments after declaring their identity to be anymic, or maybe years later, they discover the identity that finally clicks. And just as much, it's possible that um, sorry, just as much, it's possible that they later discover what they thought had finally clicked really just isn't quite it either, and ultimately end up taking on the term anymic. Someone could also choose to create a name for their identity and then just use that name instead of the term anymic. Questions, comments, etc. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now just kind of onto the extra stuff. I've been working on creating a symbol to represent anymic identities. Not that a symbol is necessary, but I think it's fun. This isn't finalized by any means, but so far it's the top contender. If anyone else has ideas for a symbol, please do let me know. I love seeing what others can come up with. So this is meant to look vaguely like a phylogenetic tree, mostly because the term started out in the non-human identity space, but also just because I think it's a neat categorization system. The filled-in circles represent known and named categories/identities. The empty circle represents a category/identity that is known but is unnamed. The broken line underneath the empty circle is somewhat of a new addition recommended by one of the folks who helped with the coining. This represents how this category/identity is different from those around it. It's not quite connected to anything else that's known. That said, the line is still reaching out to the circle because the category/identity is not completely disconnected from those around it. What those other circles symbolize are similar identities. That could be other animals in general for someone who identified as just an anymic Therian, or it could be more specific, like other known fox species for someone who is a fox Therian. Anyways, again, not set in stone symbol, but for now, it's what I've got. Questions, comments, concerns? Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, final thoughts. I couldn't think of what to write on this slide, but just a few, just a few final thoughts. Um, I wanted to do this panel to spread the word about this term, mostly because I do think that this term has the potential to be really helpful for some folks. Or maybe it's somewhat selfish in that I want to help others understand me and my experience a little better. I know it's not the most specific term in the world. Saying I'm an anemic Contherian doesn't give you any clearer of a picture of what my identity is like, but I suppose what it does do is let others know in one word that I'm something that isn't named, something that may be rare, something different, without just having to jump in with my 3-page explanation right away. That's the important thing to me and to the others who coined the term. I hope this term can help others, if not just to give others a chance to think about their experiences and broaden their ideas of what their identity or identities could be. The world, the universe, the multiverse, whatever you believe in, is so incredibly vast, and there's so much out there that we don't know about and that we don't have names for. That's why Anymic is here, to give a name to the unnamed. Anyways, thank you all for joining me for this. I hope it wasn't too boring or anything. I appreciate you all for coming and listening. And if anyone has questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat now or just message me at any time. Okay. Right. Yeah, the symbol is a little bit complex and maybe a little more complex than I wanted it to be, but like I said, work in progress. I think this term would help a lot of people. Yes. Yes, it really, as somebody who is that person, it's me. I'm the one who had helped, who felt left out for not having a named kin type. For real though, like I said, I do actually have a 3-page document that explains the entirety of my identity and my experiences, and all of that because I felt really weird coming into spaces and being asked like, "What's your stereotype?" and not having a good answer. Like I couldn't say unknown because, like I said, it is known. I know exactly what it is. I know what my experiences are, but I don't have a name for it. So, well, thank you for that very kind comment. Oh, that definitely sounds like it could apply, Maggie. Like for real. It do be like that. I'm so glad you feel seen. Okay. That's pretty much all that I've got. I think I'm gonna shut down the stage. But I will still be hanging out in the comments. So if anybody has questions or comments or whatever, like I said, just feel free to comment slash reach out. And I'll be right there. Um, Thanks again for everyone who came. I really appreciate it. Um, and that's it. Thank you.